Hello and welcome to Booklust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at University Bookstore is author and illustrator Chris Van Allsburg.
Happy to be here.
It's so nice of you to stop by and bring along the newest book, The Chronicles of Harris Burdick, which follows upon another book that you were responsible for bringing into print by Harris Burdick.
Exactly, and I appreciate your choice of words. So often people are inclined to attribute the work of Burdick to myself, based largely on its strong similarity to my own graphic style. But I always assert that the introduction of the Mysteries of Harris Burdick details exactly how these drawings came into my possession.
And will you share that? Because I noticed that both books are dedicated to the same person who also had a hand in making Harris Burdick's illustrations much better known to the public.
Right. Some years ago, I was at a small library in Amherst, Massachusetts, and I was giving a presentation, and at the end of these presentations, people line up to have their books signed. And often when I've done these things, I find that there are people who will hold back toward the end of the line, or they'll even step outside the line, because you can tell that they want to share something with the author, something personal. You hope it's nothing dangerous, but I noticed that there was an elderly gentleman, 70s maybe, possibly a little older. He was holding back, and sure enough, he waited for the line to clear, and he finally got up to the table, and he told me that there was something that I needed to see that he had in his possession. And he said that it was a group of drawings that had come into his possession some years earlier, and their style, their mood, the technique, he just thought I needed to see these because they were so similar to my own. And I was obviously curious, and so I agreed to get in his car with him, and we drove not too far from the library. And what he had to share with me were the Burdick drawings, and he explained to me how they came into his possession. He was an editor and publisher of children's books in Boston in the early 50s. One morning, a man came into his office unannounced, no appointment, cold call, and he announced to Peter Wenders, the editor, that he had brought with him 14 pictures from 14 stories. He'd completed all the stories. He'd done many pictures for each of the stories. But on that day, he had decided that he would bring one image from each story. Now, Wenders obviously was puzzled by this because it's eccentric, to say the least, that someone could work for so long and create such a body of work, and at a relatively distant point in this effort, finally work up the courage to share it, to say, now is the time. And so he brought this work to Wenders. And Wenders was very impressed by what he saw. They're very large charcoal drawings. Extremely enthusiastic. So enthusiastic, he asked Burdick, the artist, to return the next day, or if possible the day after, with the missing material, the other stories, the other pictures. And Peter Wenders waited excitedly for Burdick's return, which never happened. One day went by, 2, 3, 4, 5, and Burdick never came back. So Peter Wenders was left with these 14 pictures, which had on them the caption that identified where in the story these pictures would be placed, and also the title of the story from which these pictures came. Wenders was in a difficult position. He didn't know how to return them. He decided, I may as well keep them, and which is exactly what he did. And he was careful to archive them in his own home. And over the years, he discovered that taking these pictures out and sharing them with his children and with his children's friends, that they all had the same reaction, which was that it was almost impossible to look at the combination of an image, a title, and a caption without being provoked, without wondering, what was the story Burdick intended to tell? And with that provocation, and possibly with a little inspiration from the Wenders parents, the Peter Wenders and his wife, encouraging their children to actually write, well, what do you think Burdick had in mind, and encourage them to write it down.
Wow. So
it's an incredible story.
It is an incredible story. It is. It shows just a great imagination on everybody's part. So the Mysteries of Harris Burdick came out.
Yes.
It's hard not to read them and feel your heart beating a little faster, and just, as you said, that wondering what that entire story was like. How did it come about then that we now have the stories, or some stories?
Well, we have 14 versions.
Yes.
Or I suppose you could call them even speculations about what Burdick might have had in mind when he was writing the stories that we have are lost to history. Over the years, as soon as the Mysteries of Harris Burdick was published, I started receiving copious amounts of mail. My books have always generated quite a bit of correspondence from kids, but the Mysteries of Harris Burdick trebled, quadrupled the volume, because teachers were using it in classrooms to inspire kids to write stories. And I would get cover letters from teachers saying, you know, I've had kids who are camped out in the back of the room and not paying attention to anything that's going on, and when I handed out these Burdick pictures, these kids actually discovered that they had a story to tell. And so they were delighted with being able to make that happen. And often these kids would write one, and then without being assigned to do a second one, would undertake it themselves. This was actually referred to in the introduction, because Peter Wenders described his own family's experience with these stories, these pictures. And so it was heartening for me to see that the publication of the Burdick drawings was having the same effect on a much wider audience.
The authors who have contributed to the Chronicles of Harris Burdick range from Tabitha King to Sherman Alexie to Walter Dean Myers to Linda Sue Park. I mean, a huge, diverse assortment of writers who both normally write for teens and kids and are normally write for adults. And how are they? Did you have a hand in who you were going to ask to?
There was a point when I was discussing with my editor at Hope Mifflin, Margaret Ramo, discussing these gigantic quantities of stories that I'd gotten from children, and we thought about possibly doing a Chronicles of Harris Burdick, which would have been an enormous volume with the children's work. But about 10 years ago, Stephen King, who evidently had embraced the book in exactly the same spirit the Wenders family had, which is that you look at these drawings and the family gathers around and tells stories. Hence the contribution by Tabitha, his wife. And Stephen, about 10 years ago, asked for permission to use the reproduction of the image which inspired him to write a Burdick story, which was called The House on Maple Street. And he collected that into an anthology. It was published along with this picture of the house on Maple Street. And my editor said, well, rather than compiling, you know, a 6,000-page book of children's stories, Stephen's written this story. Why don't we ask him if he would be willing to have that included into a book where we invite other experienced storytellers, which is an expression I prefer to use rather than saying going to the pros. But just experienced storytellers, and seeing what their response might be to the Burdick images and captions, titles. So Margaret Ramo, my editor, and I sat down and we made out a list, kind of a sort of a wish list. We expected there would be some people who would not be interested, who would be too busy, have other things on their plate. But it was remarkable, because when Margaret sent out these invitations, the response was almost universal, saying, you know, they would call back in 2 days. Because often I get requests like this, and you stick them on a bulletin board, and you call back 3 weeks later, you know. But Margaret was amazed. She said, these authors' agents are calling me back 2 days later and saying, yeah, I want to do that. and I want to get in early so I can pick the drawing that I want.
Oh, yes, right. So they weren't assigned a drawing. Basically, they could, the early ones at least could pick.
The earlier people who accepted the invitation had a larger body of work to choose from.
Right.
Both Stephen and Tabitha had already written their stories, so those two drawings were off the table. I know Lois Lowry was especially eager to tell her story of the nun suspended in the cathedral.
Yes.
And felt fortunate to lay her hands on that one.
If the author's name hadn't been included at the beginning, I wouldn't have been able to say, oh, that's a Lois Lowry story. Oh, that's a Walter Dean Myers story. It just seems like they all sort of in some way subsumed what they were known for in the spirit of this.
Right. Well, I don't know if they purposely tried to work out of their strike zone, so to speak, but they were given material which set them off on that course. I mean, this ordinarily you are inspired by events in your own life, things that you see, right, that you connect with. In this case, they were responding to things that someone else had connected with, namely Harris Burdick. Mm-hmm. And I suppose just that simple difference would require them to shift a little bit to one side or the other in order to essentially get in the Burdick groove.
This book, the two Burdick books that you're responsible for bringing to the public,
right,
are just part of your other things that you've done as an artist and as a writer. And all of them, in my mind, I think the reason you were so attracted to the Burdick books is because you have such a wondrous and such a willing suspension of disbelief and ready to embrace the odd and the unusual and the little bit eerie, perhaps.
Well, thank you. I would agree with that. And it was a discovery I made in my first book, which is that the inexplicable is a little hook that gets set in just about anybody's mind if you can't quite figure something out. And in the first book, which is called The Garden of Abdul Ghazazi, I got to a point in the story where I realized that there was an ambiguity there. And I wondered, well, it is a children's book. Are children comfortable with ambiguity? Or there's no resolution there, clearly. And I finally said, well, I think I'm done. And so there's a question posed on the final page of the book for the protagonist in the book, but it's obviously also posed for the reader. And these readers are 8, 9, 10. But the question that was posed was basically, are there magicians who are truly wizards, who can do things that are phenomenal, or are there merely magicians who can fool us into thinking they've done something phenomenal, something inexplicable? And while that was not the premise that I set out to undertake with my narrative, that's where I found myself at the end. And I thought, well, that's great. I was kind of proud of myself. And I think that initial experience and the satisfaction, this idea that when a book is closed, it's not done.
Right.
And to varying degrees, I've explored that idea of the not quite complete narrative in many of my books, not every one, but many of them, because I just think it acknowledges a specific reality of the human mind and imagination, that the mind's determined to fill the hole.
Is charcoal your preferred medium to
Well,
do?
I didn't study. I studied sculpture as a student in
that's why
school.
they're so sculptural, the illustrations,
Well,
many of them.
My drawing experience in college was mostly simply to take charcoal or sometimes other drawing mediums and draw the pictures of the things I was going to make. So these dimensional objects didn't exist yet, and so that was actually my experience as an image maker. And so I wasn't really drawing pictures, I was just drawing pictures of objects,
Right.
images of objects. And so then when I began doing picture making, and specifically illustration, Those were the materials that were handy to me. Those were the ones I knew how to use.
You were comfortable with
I was
them.
comfortable with them, and I started out working monochromatically. I've worked in color now maybe in a third of the titles that I've done because I like to keep the process interesting. But I remember when the first book came out, The Garden of Abdul Gazazi, that more than one review praised my choice of doing them monochromatically in black and white because they reinforced the slightly surreal nature of the tale. And of course I was flattered, but what they didn't know is that they were praising a limitation I had, not a choice I made.
All the better.
Yes, right.
And I think that review, the people who said that or who pointed that out in the reviews, I mean, that's the feeling that I've gotten from those monochromatic illustrations, is that, and this is what you share with Harris Burdick, I think, is that black and white does add to the eeriness or the unanswered or unfinished.
It does, and for people our age, there's something slightly nostalgic about it as well. But I've reflected on what it means to young people because they have no nostalgic connection to black and white. It's just downright peculiar to them. Because there's no color there. They can read the images and interpret them quite easily, but I wonder what effect it has on them. I gather it has not a particularly negative one because they seem to take pleasure in the pictures, and maybe they do apprehend a kind of spookiness in them that brings them pleasure. You're
the author and illustrator of The Polar Express, which is now more than a quarter of a century old.
Yes.
Were you surprised at how popular and enduring that book was, or because it shares a lot of that sort of way of looking at the world that is sort of straight on but acknowledges all the different dimensions?
Well, some of that elasticity may come from a narrative impulse which is not particularly realistic, but a determination to create pictures that asserts that the story is absolutely true. So I become providing evidence for the reality of the narrative by creating pictures that can't be refuted. See, I mean, in the case of something like Jumanji, you don't think rhinoceros can stampede through a dining room? Well, here's an image showing you how it can happen. And with Polar Express, there are some leaps of imagination there, though I don't think of them as particularly imaginative when I was reflecting on what it felt like when I took that trip many years ago. It seemed quite natural as we approached the North Pole that it was not a little chalet manned by 12 elves because everybody on the train knew that they were making millions and millions of toys there. So none of us were surprised to see something that looked like an ancient mill town from New England or something. So I'm giving credit for my imagination, but in a case like that, and actually in other books I've written, I don't feel like I'm exercising my imagination. I'm exercising my rationality.
Do you have favorite illustrators whose drawings you admire in the books that they've done? Or
because I studied sculpture, and it wasn't my dream as an undergraduate or graduate student to become a book illustrator, I didn't familiarize myself with the canon. I was familiar. I'd seen as a boy Alice in Wonderland, and I'm sure I was exposed to Babar.
Right.
And Harold and the Purple Crayon, which remains one of my favorite books from my childhood. But when I began drawing, those weren't the things that interested me or motivated me. I was more influenced by the work of artists. And actually one of these artists I think could be considered an illustrator. His name was Max Klinger. He was an engraver, a Viennese engraver. And he did a series of engravings called the Glove Cycle, which long before Freud had advanced some ideas about the meaning of the symbols that appear in our dreams, or the symbology of the images that appear in our dreams. He was already onto this somehow, and he did this series of drawings about a lost glove and a man who retrieves the glove and his yearnings to return the glove to the young woman who he saw drop it, at the outdoor Viennese roller rink, and he's tormented by his efforts to return it. There's a series of 10 images, and I saw one of those in an art history book when I was about 20, and it just had an impact on me. It was just, I don't know why I was drawn to it, but since I actually have acquired my own original portfolio of the glove cycle, and it was kind of an important sort of touchstone for me. I mean, it derived its unsettling atmosphere because some of the images are strange because of what's depicted, but there are some that are more ordinary that are just as peculiar, off-putting, strange, and it's simply because of the simple things that artists study: composition, direction of light, use of tonality, point of view. And it was looking at that work that made me realize that you could make a picture that established very clearly a particular kind of atmosphere and mood that was not dependent on wild subject matter. And that was a big lesson for me.
Do you ever want to do just a longer narrative without the illustrations? I mean, take that sort of sense of mystery and wizard.
Well, I was one of the invitees for
yes,
the Chronicles,
and you did a story.
And
yes.
I wrote a short story, and I will tell you I was a little intimidated because I was in some accomplished company, and had not written a short story or a story of that length. But I warmed up to it. I had an idea that came to me pretty quickly after looking at the material, which in the case of my own story depicts a young girl who's holding out two caterpillars. And the title of that story that Burdick gave to it was Oscar and Alphonse. And she's holding these two caterpillars, and the caption is, she knew it was time to send them back. The caterpillars slowly spelled out goodbye. Now there's some easy precedents to reach for. One of them being E.B. White.
Right. Yes,
This idea that a child can communicate with, but actually in E.B. White, the communication was not simply with the child, but in this case, I was looking for an opportunity to account for what appears to be supernatural, and that is actually consistent through all the Burdick stories. And my guess is that when Burdick visited Wenders, he took out what he thought were the strangest pieces. So this is a strange piece too, a young girl who apparently can communicate with caterpillars. But I tried to accept the challenge of writing a story that suggested that either she could communicate with caterpillars or she was extraordinarily intelligent and only used the caterpillars as a way of concealing her own insights because she didn't want to draw the attention to herself. So amongst the 14 Chronicle stories, I think mine is the only one that provides a prosaic account. Not a particularly prosaic one.
Right. A possible
one.
Right.
One is which is extraordinary but not supernatural.
Right. Yeah. Now, do you think we will have any more Harris Burdick oeuvre sightings?
Well, there was a desire on the part of schoolroom teachers to have large images of the Burdick pictures in a portfolio version that was unbound so that they could put them on the wall or hand out. And right about the time that Houghton decided that they would love to be able to accompany the classroom teachers, and they produced this,
yes.
I got a letter from a book antiquarian down in New Jersey, a fellow named Daniel Hirsch, who had whose business was to go basically buy old libraries, people whose estates that had heirs who had no interest in the books, or there were no heirs. And he described to me a library up in Bangor, Maine, that he was called to appraise, and it had been the property of a woman named Hazel Bartlett, who had left her she had no descendants, no relatives. She'd left all the proceeds of her estate to the local ASPCA. So the ASPCA was essentially the executor, and they invited him up to appraise the library to see if he wanted to buy it. He did end up buying this library, which included some extraordinary volumes, including an original Pinocchio by Collodi. But one of the things that he treasured most from this fairly vast stash of books was a mirror which had carved on the frame the characters of Through the Looking Glass from Alice in Wonderland. And so he took the frame along with these many volumes of books, went back to New Jersey, over time sold the books to bibliophiles, kept the frame hung on his wall, and one day this frame fell from the wall and it broke and the glass shattered, the mirrored glass. And as he took the shards away, he discovered behind it a Burdick drawing, which was done in exactly the same style as the 14 that were already discovered, and it even bore a title, Missing in Venice, which is one of the stories in the Burdick collection, and had a caption. And so that image was actually lent to Houghton Mifflin, and they were able to include it in the portfolio version. But what those clues mean, it's hard to say. Hazel Bartlett, Harris Burdick. This was clearly a woman.
Right.
We know that the Bartlett was, Harris Burdick was not. So there's some obvious mysteries to be solved there. How the work ended up in Bangor, and where the other. I haven't done the math, but 14 squared is quite a few drawings. So either Burdick was pulling somebody's leg, or Wenders was pulling somebody's leg. The possibility exists that Wenders may have created these things and was too shy as a publisher to submit them to himself or to other publishers. Or perhaps there's another explanation for these drawings.
Perhaps. Chris, our time has just flown by. I feel like we could talk for at least another half an hour, if not longer. But I want to thank you so much for coming by today.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
Good.
Nice
Thank
to talk to
you.
you.